Well, it had been a full week. It started with huge crowds on the streets of Jerusalem, and now here they were, just 13 of them, in a private room celebrating the Passover. And only 2 people in that room knew where this night was going to lead. Jesus knew because he's Jesus. And Judas knew because he'd put the wheels into motion the day before when he had agreed to betray his friend for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus knew that he'd already been betrayed, and yet in this amazing display of grace, he still invites Judas to celebrate with them. That's the invitation that continues to be extended by Jesus, even knowing all that we will do, all the various ways in which we will betray his love and his name. He still says, come. Last Sunday we celebrated Palm Sunday, and we looked at the wondrous celebration of Jesus as people everywhere were saying, the King has come. But there was a dark side too. It was after Jesus had entered into Jerusalem riding on that donkey, while the crowds praised him and waved palm branches, that the religious authorities felt they had no option but to take matters into their own hands. It was at that point of celebration that they decided this Jesus must die. It was that decision which led us to this point only 5 days later. It was a perfect setup. It had to be this way. During the day, Jesus was surrounded by crowds of sympathetic people who'd come to hear him preach. People whose lives had been impacted by Jesus. People, perhaps they'd been healed by him, or they'd maybe had somebody in their family touched by him. Maybe they'd heard his teaching on forgiveness and had restored a relationship. Perhaps they'd been part of the multitude that he fed on the shores of Galilee. Regardless of how and why, those who gathered around Jesus that day would pose a considerable problem for the authorities. And so they came for him, and they came under the cover of darkness. Even then they were taking no chances. And so to arrest the man who had spoken so much of love, forgiveness and grace, a crowd was sent. 3 of the Gospels simply identify them as a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. However, John gets more specific and tells us in chapter 18 of his Gospel that Judas the betrayer knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. And now, with blazing torches, lanterns and weapons, they arrived at the Olive Grove. I don't know if they expected Christ to fight or run, but either way they came prepared. What they didn't prepare for was Jesus' surrender. Luke 22, reading from verse 52, it says, Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple guard and the elders who'd come for him, Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts. You did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. In that one statement, Jesus was letting them know that he already knew everything. There were no surprises. You see, even though the night arrest made for good strategy and good theatre, it was the beginning of the dreadfully flawed persecution of Jesus, and I don't know if most of us know how flawed it was. Jesus knew what they knew. That was, if they could not prove a case against him, then they would have to fabricate one. Historical documents tell us that there were 2 major problems with this arrest. The first was that it was performed at night. There were all kinds of guidelines and regulations and rules in place for the Jewish judicial process, and one was that neither arrests nor trials were ever permitted at night. 2,000 years ago in Israel, justice was under the authority of the Sanhedrin. They were the supreme religious authority at the time. They functioned kind of like a Supreme Court in our day. And there would have been no discussion about the separation of religion and state back then. While Israel may have been under Roman rule, they still considered themselves a theocracy. In our nation we enjoy a democracy, And that word can be traced back to two Greek words, demos meaning people and kratia meaning power. 2,000 years ago, Israel was a theocracy. Kratia still meant power, but theos meant God. And so, in matters of religious and civil law, you had a religious court, not a civil court. And it was the Sanhedrin. It comprised members of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priesthood. The full Grand Sanhedrin, they called it, had 71 members. It was only convened for matters of national security. And then you had the cabinet of 23, and that was most probably the group that conspired against Christ. They functioned just like courts everywhere, under constraints, and one of those constraints was that justice must be performed in the daylight hours. There was some symbolism wrapped up in that. Justice was all about being transparent and about light being shone into darkness. So justice should be able to bear up to the scrutiny that would come upon it in the light of day. But here, they find Jesus at night with torches in hand. They sought him in the darkness. The arrest of Jesus happened somewhere between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning, and that was in direct violation of the law. The other issue is that Jesus was arrested on the information of Judas. And under the law of that day, someone who was an associate of the accused could not provide the evidence needed for an arrest in a capital case because of an obvious conflict of interest. They'd be as guilty as the accused. And yet the story here revolves around the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, one of his closest associates. So this was a blatant breach of the rules. When the crowd came to arrest Jesus, Judas steps towards him and kisses him. That was done to make sure that in the darkness of the night, lit only by flickering torches, no mistake was going to be made. The right man would be arrested. Because the one thing that those who conspired to end Jesus' ministry agreed on was that Jesus must die, and we have to get the right man. But it wasn't only the arrest that was flawed, the trials were flawed as well. Notice I said trials, not trial. What happened after the arrest of Jesus would have been considered a travesty by today's legal standards. And back then it shouldn't have happened either. From his arrest to this interrogation, to the conviction, to the sentence, things were done differently than they would have been done today, and they were done against the rules and regulations that were in place then. Now it's to be expected. We often watch historical figures that are judged by today's standards, and very seldom do they fare well. So we can't really expect, I suppose, that the trial will be held in an occupied country 2,000 years ago would be applied the same standards that we have today. But we would expect that they would apply the standards of their day, and they didn't. That's very significant. Shows you how dark and evil this whole process was. In 1948, a British judge named Frank Powell wrote a book called The Trial of Jesus Christ. And in this book it looks at the trial of Jesus in light of the historical standards of that day, specifically the way that a capital case was supposed to be tried under Jewish law. What Powell discovered was that there was nothing fair about the trial of Jesus in any way, and very little was done properly. Now, around the same time, American lawyer David Breed wrote The Trial of Christ and found a number of errors that under Jewish and Roman law would have been considered serious breaches. Today they'd be considered reversible errors, and you'd be able to appeal and win that appeal based on those errors. Breed in his book identifies no less than 17 issues that contravened the trial laws of that time. 17 separate breaches. From Jesus' first appearance in front of Annas, we see that nobody is really interested in justice. They are interested only in ridding themselves of Jesus. Annas had no legal standing in the Jewish community. Yes, he'd been the high priest, but he was retired. He was the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. So why would Jesus have been taken to Annas and into his home? I'd suspect it goes back to an event that happened earlier in the week. You'll recall when Jesus cleansed the temple courts. He came into the courts and saw that money changers and vendors were taking advantage of the pilgrims who had come for the Passover celebration. Let me read that to you. Mark chapter 11, reading from verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." So here's this interesting tidbit from history. The man who was in charge of what happened in the temple courts, the man who profited from the extortion that was happening in the temple courts, was none other than Annas. The temple courtyards were even referred to by the Jews at that point as the bazaars of the sons of Annas. And so you see, Annas demanded the names of Jesus' followers and what they'd been teaching. When Jesus didn't give the answers that Annas was looking for, he was beaten. And in turn, Jesus responds, John 18 verse 23. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But I've spoken the truth. Why did you strike me?" So it was at that point that Annas had Jesus bound like a criminal and sent to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. In the Gospel of John, in reference to Jesus, Caiaphas told his colleagues this. John 11 verse 50. "You do not realize that it is better for you that one man dies for the people than the whole nation perish." 2 days later we read of this account, Matthew 26 verses 3 and 4. "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him." So the next person who's involved in Jesus' trial had already stated publicly his intention to have Jesus killed. I'm thinking that Caiaphas might have had a little bit of a problem being unbiased. Caiaphas knew the truth about Jesus. Matthew 26 verse 59. "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they didn't find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, 'This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' As we now know, under the Jewish law, a capital trial could only happen during the daytime. They're still under the cover of darkness. And criminal cases were not permitted to be held during the religious celebrations, and the Passover celebration had started the day before. Another rule broken. The trial was also supposed to be held in the meeting place of the Sanhedrin. That was the law. But they were meeting in the home of Caiaphas. At least 2 witnesses had to be examined separately, yet here the witnesses were examined together after being coached to twist their words and twist the words of Christ. Also, under Jewish law, only a not guilty verdict could be delivered the same day as the trial. If the verdict was to be guilty, then at least 1 night had to pass before sentencing, so the tribunal had time to reflect and perhaps consider mercy. Jesus' whole trial finished in a few hours. These were the Sanhedrin's own rules, and in their push to get rid of Jesus, they were prepared to make a mockery of the very legal system they established and which was admired in their day. The charge that Caiaphas and his cronies finally settled on was a charge of blasphemy, that Jesus had claimed to be God. The problem for them was that 300 years earlier, they might have the authority to have Jesus executed, but not now, not under Roman law. So we pick up the story here in John 18 verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Well, at least they were conscientious about that. The problem was that blasphemy was a religious charge, and Pilate had no authority. He could care less about the religion of the Jews. Luke 23 verse 2 says, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be a Messiah, the king.'" So the charge has changed from blasphemy to treason, and that he didn't see any evidence of treason, so they upped the ante. Verse 5, Luke 23. But they insisted. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee, and then he's all the way here. But you see, it was here that Pilate saw a way out. He didn't want to execute a carpenter. He didn't want to alienate religious leaders further. So he passed the buck. Verse 6. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. This was the same Herod who had John the Baptist killed, and it was his father who tried to kill Jesus when he was a newborn. We're told that Herod had heard about Jesus and wanted to meet him and see him perform a miracle. You know, comedians often tell how annoying it is when they meet somebody in a social setting and someone says, "Oh, say something funny." They want you to perform. They want you to do your stuff. And it's very frustrating. Very seldom does a preacher get to eat with a group of people without being asked to say grace. It's kind of the same thing. Well, I'm reminded of Herod's song in the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical Jesus Christ Superstar many years ago. You might recall it. The words go, "So you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. Prove to me that you're divine. Change my water into wine. That's all you need do. I'll know it's all true. Come on, King of the Jews." But you know, we're told that Jesus doesn't even grace Herod with an answer. So Herod puts a purple robe on Christ and sends him back to Pilate, saying that he just found Jesus annoying. So what is Pilate to do with Jesus? He has the religious leaders and the mob that incited demanding Jesus to be executed. But he can find no evidence to support a case against him, and neither can Herod. Pilate's wife has shown up in the middle of everything, telling him about a dream that she had about Jesus and how Pilate really should release him. Pilate tries. He tells the crowd that as a gesture of goodwill, because it's the Passover, he'll release one prisoner. And he stands Jesus up next to a known murderer named Barabbas and offers the crowd their choice of who they should let go free. He figured it was a no-brainer. Jesus has done nothing wrong and this guy's a murderer. And the mob, who was egged on by the authorities, looked at Jesus and yelled, "Crucify him, crucify him." Things are getting out of control, so Pilate has Jesus flogged with a steel-tipped whip, but even that doesn't satisfy the bloodthirsty crowd. Pilate now faces the question which every human being on this planet must face one day. What do I do with Jesus? We are clearly told in Scripture that Pilate had found no fault in this man, wanted to set him free. But all Pilate could see and hear was the angry faces, the bloodthirsty pleas of the world before him. Pilate then washes his hands of the whole issue and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It's your responsibility." So at that point, Pilate delivers Jesus into the hands of the people and effectively says, "What will you do with Jesus?" Well, we all know the answer of the crowd. They murdered him. Brothers and sisters, the same question which Pilate faced on that dark and horrible day is the question every single human being must answer sooner or later. What do I do with Jesus? How do I respond to this man, this Messiah, this Saviour? Do I reject him? Do I ignore him? Or do I embrace him as Lord? Of all the days on our calendar, I think Good Friday is a day when that question confronts us most powerfully. As we gaze upon this innocent man hanging on a cross, that question is right in our face. What do I do with this Jesus?